The cabin door exploded inward. Grace Holloway didn't scream. She was beyond that now. Blood soaked through her dress where the baby kicked against her ribs, 8 months of life refusing to wait for safety. Her youngest son's lips had turned blue an hour ago. The men with rifles were half a mile behind them, maybe less. And the man whose door she'd just pounded on, this Cole Mercer her dying husband sent her to find, was pointing a shotgun at her face, telling her to get the hell off his property. She had maybe 30 seconds to convince a stranger to die for her family. The storm swallowed her first words, but she tried anyway. Before we begin this journey through blood and snow, through betrayal and bullets, I need you with me until the very end. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Grace's story travels across this world. Hit that like button if you believe some debts can only be paid in gunpowder and grace. Now let me tell you about the night everything burned. The wind didn't howl in the Wyoming mountains. It screamed. It tore through the pines like something with teeth, stripping bark and sanity in equal measure. Grace Holloway had stopped feeling her feet 2 miles back. She couldn't remember what warmth felt like anymore. The only thing keeping her upright was the weight of her oldest boy's hand in hers, and the terrible knowledge that if she fell, they all died. "Mama, I can't," Samuel's voice cracked. He was 9 years old and trying so hard to be brave. His younger brother Thomas hadn't spoken in over an hour. The 6-year-old stumbled along between them, his breathing shallow and wrong. "You can," Grace said. Her own voice sounded like gravel. "You will." She didn't tell him about the blood she'd been trailing for the last quarter mile. She didn't mention how the contractions had started an hour ago, still far apart but getting closer. The baby inside her seemed to know death was circling, seemed to be fighting its way toward a world that might kill it before it drew its first breath. Behind them, somewhere in the white chaos of the blizzard, men with guns were following their tracks. Grace had watched those men put 3 bullets into her husband 6 hours ago. Michael had died slowly, which was the cruelest part. He'd had time to grab her face with bloody hands, time to rasp out instructions she barely understood. Cole Mercer, Black Ridge, the only one. He'd coughed blood onto the snow between them. "The only honest man I ever knew. He'll help you. He has to." Then Michael Holloway, the deputy land assessor who'd made the mistake of being too good at his job, had stopped breathing. The men who killed him had ransacked their home looking for the documents he'd hidden. Grace had the papers now, folded inside her coat next to her skin, next to the baby that wouldn't stop kicking. Land deeds. Forgeries. Names that went all the way up to a federal judge named Horace Keene. Her husband had stumbled onto a theft so large it bent the law itself into new shapes. And now she was dragging her children through hell because Michael had been too stubborn to look away from corruption, and she'd been too stubborn to let him die for nothing. "There," Samuel pointed with his free hand. "Mama, there's light." Grace squinted through the snow. At first she saw nothing but white and darkness and the skeletal shapes of frozen trees. Then, yes, a flicker of orange, a cabin window, maybe a quarter mile ahead. Her heart, which had been barely beating for the last hour, suddenly hammered against her ribs. The cabin at Black Ridge. It had to be. She pulled the boys forward with renewed strength she didn't actually possess. Thomas stumbled, went down to one knee. Grace hauled him up without breaking stride. His lips were blue. His eyes weren't focusing right. She had maybe 20 minutes before hypothermia took him somewhere she couldn't follow. The cabin grew larger as they climbed. It was rough-built but solid, tucked against a stand of pines that offered some shelter from the wind. Smoke rose from the chimney. A single window glowed with firelight. It looked like the most beautiful thing Grace had ever seen. She half-carried Thomas up the 3 steps to the porch. Samuel followed, shaking so hard his teeth rattled. Grace raised her fist and pounded on the door. Nothing. She pounded again, harder. "Hello, please! My children!" The door opened 6 inches. A shotgun barrel emerged first, followed by a face that looked like it had been carved from stone in bad weather. The man was maybe 40, maybe older. Hard to tell when someone had clearly stopped caring about anything soft years ago. His eyes were the color of iron in winter. "Get off my property, sir," he said. Grace had prepared speeches in her head during the climb. Explanations, pleas, appeals to Christian charity. All of them evaporated when she looked into those cold eyes and realized this man meant exactly what he said. "My son is dying," she said instead. flat, factual. Not my problem. His lips are blue. He's got maybe 10 minutes before his heart stops. The man's jaw tightened. I don't know you. I don't know what trouble you brought to my mountain. Turn around and then watch him die. Grace shifted Thomas forward, let the firelight fall across her boy's face. Right here, in the snow. You can watch it happen. I'll make sure you see every second. Something flickered in the man's face. Not kindness exactly. Maybe just the ghost of whoever he used to be before he'd exiled himself to this frozen nowhere. You're Cole Mercer, Grace said. It wasn't a question. His hand tightened on the shotgun. Who told you that name? Michael Holloway. Before he died. Before the men who killed him started hunting us. Cole Mercer stared at her. The wind screamed between them. Thomas made a small sound, almost a whimper, and Grace felt something inside her chest crack clean through. Please, she heard herself say. The word tasted like ashes. I'm begging you. You shouldn't have come here, Mercer said, but he lowered the shotgun. One night, soon as the storm breaks, you're gone. He stepped aside. Grace didn't wait for him to change his mind. She pushed past him into the cabin, dragging her children into the warmth that felt like knives against her frozen skin. The interior was sparse. One room, mostly. A fireplace dominated the far wall, burning with the kind of heat that meant the man who lived here knew cold intimately. A rough table, 2 chairs, a bed in the corner that looked like it had never held 2 people. Everything was clean and hard and utterly without comfort. Get them by the fire, Mercer said. He'd already closed the door, was already barring it with a heavy piece of timber. Not too close. Frostbite. Grace knew about frostbite. She'd grown up in these mountains, back before she'd married a man idealistic enough to get himself killed. She positioned Thomas on the floor near the hearth, started working on his boots with numb fingers. Samuel collapsed beside his brother, shaking. How far behind are they? Mercer asked. Grace looked up. The man was at the window now, peering out into the storm with the shotgun cradled in his arms like a sleeping child. I don't know, she admitted. We had maybe an hour's head start, but they're on horses. Horses won't help in this wind. They'll have to walk them, same as you. He glanced at her, and for the first time his eyes registered what he was seeing. You're bleeding. Grace followed his gaze to the floor. A small pool had formed beneath her skirt. Not from the baby, from her feet, she realized. The boots she'd been wearing had fallen apart a mile back. She'd been walking on frozen ground with nothing but stockings and willpower. I'll live, she said. Maybe. Mercer moved to a cabinet, pulled out blankets that smelled like cedar and smoke. He threw them toward the boys without gentleness. Get their wet clothes off. All of them. Wrap them tight. Grace worked methodically, stripping Thomas first. His skin was mottled white and red, his lips still that terrible blue. But when she wrapped him in the blanket and pulled him closer to the fire, he started to cry, weak, quiet sounds that were the most beautiful thing she'd heard in hours. That's good, Mercer said, surprising her. Crying means he's still fighting. Samuel was in better shape. He'd been walking, generating heat. Within minutes of being wrapped and positioned by the fire, he started to look almost human again. His eyes found Grace across the dim room. Is Daddy really gone? He asked. The question hit her like a fist. Grace opened her mouth, found nothing there. She nodded. Samuel looked at the floor. Didn't cry. 9 years old and already learning that some wounds went too deep for tears. Mercer was moving around the cabin now, checking windows, loading weapons Grace hadn't noticed before. A rifle appeared from behind the door, a pistol from beneath the table. The man moved like someone who'd spent years preparing for violence that might never come, but probably would. The papers, he said without looking at her. That's what they want? Grace touched her coat, felt the document still there. Yes. What's in them? Proof that Judge Horace Keene has been stealing land for 5 years. Federal land, private land, doesn't matter. He forges new deeds, files them through his court, sells the property to friends who pay him under the table. My husband found the pattern, found the names, found everything. Mercer was quiet for a long moment. Horace Keene. You know him? I know he's the kind of man who doesn't leave witnesses. Mercer finally turned to look at her. Michael Holloway. Skinny fellow? Always had ink on his fingers? You remember him? I remember he was the only deputy in the assessor's office who wouldn't take bribes. Something that might have been respect crossed Mercer's face. I told him once that honesty would get him killed. Guess I was right. He said you were the only lawman he trusted. I haven't been a lawman in 15 years. He said you'd help anyway. Mercer's laugh was bitter. Michael always saw things that weren't there. Thought people were better than they were. He moved to the window again. I'm letting you stay because your boy was dying. Don't mistake that for heroism. Grace felt a contraction ripple through her abdomen. Not strong, not yet, but getting closer. She breathed through it, kept her face neutral. The last thing she needed was this cold stranger knowing she was about to give birth in his cabin. How many men? Mercer asked. I saw 4, could be more. Armed? Rifles. Pistols. They're not lawmen. Keene's private killers. Mercer nodded like this confirmed something. Professional enough to do murder, not professional enough to track worth a damn in a blizzard. That's the only reason you're still breathing. How comforting. He almost smiled. Almost. Your husband really thought I'd risk my neck for his widow and children? He thought you'd do it because it's right. Right. Mercer repeated the word like it was in a foreign language. Lady, I learned a long time ago that right just gets you buried faster. I exposed corruption once. You know what it got me? Fired, blacklisted, hunted. I came to this mountain to get away from people like you, people who think truth matters more than survival. Then why'd you let us in? Grace met his eyes without flinching. You could have left Thomas in the snow, could have shut the door and pretended you never saw us. Mercer's jaw worked. He didn't answer. Outside, the wind shifted direction, slamming against the cabin with renewed fury. Snow hissed against the windows. The fire flickered and settled. We'll be gone in the morning, Grace said quietly, soon as the boys can walk. You can barely walk yourself. I'll manage. Where will you go? Silver Creek. There's a telegraph office. I can send the documents to the newspaper, get them published before Keene's men hunt you down and put bullets in you and your children. Mercer shook his head. Silver Creek is 15 miles from here. You won't make 5 in your condition. You don't know my condition? You're 8 months pregnant, bleeding from a dozen places, and you just walked through a blizzard that should have killed you. I know exactly your condition. He moved away from the window, started building up the fire with practiced efficiency. You're not going anywhere tomorrow. Storm like this, we're snowed in for at least 2 days. Grace's heart sank. 2 days? Maybe 3. Wind's coming from the northwest, won't blow itself out quickly. Those men will find us. Maybe, but they won't attack until the storm breaks. Too risky. Can't see, can't shoot straight, can't move effectively. They'll hole up somewhere and wait, same as us. Mercer added another log to the fire. Which gives us time. Time for what? To figure out how to keep you alive. He glanced at her boys, both now sleeping by the hearth, wrapped in blankets and starting to breathe normally. All of you. Grace wanted to argue, to insist they'd leave at first light regardless of the storm. But another contraction hit, stronger this time, and she had to bite her lip to keep from gasping. The baby was coming. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. Days, not weeks. She was trapped in a cabin with a man who didn't want her there, being hunted by killers who wouldn't stop, carrying evidence that could bring down a federal judge and the fortune he'd built on theft and murder. And she was about to give birth. Michael, she thought, you better have been right about this man. There's stew, Mercer said, nodding toward a pot hanging over the fire. Not much, but it's hot. You should eat. I'm not hungry. Don't care. Eat anyway. He pulled down 2 bowls from a shelf, started ladling food without asking permission. You're no good to those boys if you collapse. Grace accepted the bowl because he was right, because she'd learned years ago that pride was expensive and she couldn't afford it. The stew was simple. Venison, potatoes, some kind of wild herb she didn't recognize. It tasted like the best thing she'd ever eaten, which meant she'd been closer to the edge than she'd realized. Mercer ate standing up, his back to the wall, his eyes constantly moving between the window and the door. He hadn't relaxed for a second since letting them inside. You live alone up here, Grace said. Not a question. Obviously. For how long? 15 years. That's a long time to talk to yourself. I don't talk to myself. Mercer set his empty bowl aside. I don't talk at all, mostly. Preferred it that way until about an hour ago. My husband trusted you with our lives. I'm trying to understand why. Mercer was quiet for so long Grace thought he wouldn't answer. Then, we worked together once, before I stopped being a lawman. There was a corruption case, smaller than this Keene business, but dirty enough. Michael was the one who found the discrepancies in the land records. I was the one who tried to prosecute. His voice went flat. Didn't end well. What happened? The men I was investigating had friends with power. They made sure the case disappeared. Made sure I disappeared too. Mercer's hand moved unconsciously to his left shoulder, like touching an old wound. I could have kept fighting, could have gone to newspapers, federal marshals, anyone who'd listen. Instead, I came here. Built this cabin. Decided the world could rot without me. But you let us in. I let a dying child in. Don't romanticize it. Grace studied his face in the firelight, saw the lines around his eyes, the gray starting at his temples, the way his mouth settled naturally into a grim line. This was a man who'd given up on people, who'd chosen ice and isolation over the risk of caring, but he'd opened the door anyway. Thank you, she said quietly. Mercer looked uncomfortable. Save it for when we're all still breathing in 2 days. Another gust of wind hit the cabin, so hard the walls creaked. Grace saw Mercer's eyes sharpen, saw his hand move closer to the rifle leaning against the wall. What is it? She asked. Thought I heard something. In the storm? Maybe. But he moved to the window, peered out into the darkness. Or maybe I'm getting old and paranoid. Grace set her bowl aside, suddenly tense. Samuel and Thomas slept on, exhausted beyond waking. The fire crackled. The wind screamed. Then she heard it too, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. Metal on metal, brief, distant, but distinct. They found us, Mercer said. His voice was calm, almost resigned. Faster than I expected. What do we do? You stay away from the windows, keep the boys quiet if they wake. Mercer started moving around the cabin with sudden purpose, extinguishing lamps, checking weapons. How good are you with a gun? Good enough. He tossed her a pistol without warning. Grace caught it reflexively, checked the chamber like her father had taught her 20 years ago. 6 rounds, well maintained, heavy in her hand like an anchor or a promise. If they breach the door, Mercer said, aim for center mass. Don't hesitate. They sure as hell won't. Grace nodded. Her hands were steady. That surprised her. She'd just held a weapon for the first time since her wedding day, and her hands were completely steady. Maybe Michael had been wrong about a lot of things, but he'd been right about this. She was stronger than she looked, strong enough to walk through a blizzard, strong enough to watch her husband die and keep moving, strong enough to pull a trigger if it meant her children lived. How many? She asked. Mercer had pressed himself against the wall beside the window, risking quick glances outside. Can't tell in the dark. At least 2, maybe more waiting back in the trees. What are they waiting for? Us to make a mistake. Or morning, whichever comes first. He glanced at her. They know you're here. They're not going anywhere. Grace felt the baby kick, hard and insistent, like it was trying to fight its way free before the bullets started flying. Another contraction rippled through her, longer this time. She counted to 10 in her head, breathing through it. Not yet, she told the baby silently. Just give me a few more hours, please. The wind died for a moment, leaving sudden silence that felt heavier than the noise. In that silence, Grace heard a new sound. Boots on snow, close to the cabin. Moving carefully, trying to stay quiet. Mercer heard it too. He raised the rifle in one smooth motion, aimed at the door. The footsteps stopped. Grace held her breath. 10 seconds. 20. Then a voice called out, muffled by the storm, but clear enough. We know you're in there, Mrs. Holloway. Grace's blood went cold. The voice was young, confident, the kind of confidence that came from holding all the cards and knowing it. Send out the papers and we'll leave. You have my word. Mercer snorted quietly. His word. Your husband made a mistake, the voice continued, but that doesn't mean your children have to die for it. Be reasonable. Grace looked at Samuel and Thomas, still sleeping by the fire. Thought about the baby inside her. Innocent and perfect, and doomed if she believed a single word from the men outside. "What happens if I give them the documents?" she asked Mercer quietly. "They kill you anyway. Can't leave witnesses. You know that." She did know that. Had known it since the moment Michael died. These weren't men who forgave or forgot. They were men who erased problems. "Mrs. Holloway!" The voice again, sharper now. "I'm losing patience." "Don't answer," Mercer said. "Let them think we're—" The window exploded inward. Grace threw herself over her boys as glass rained down. The shot had come from somewhere in the trees, a rifle round that punched through the window and buried itself in the far wall. Samuel jerked awake with a cry. Thomas curled into a tighter ball, still too exhausted to fully wake. Mercer fired back through the broken window, 3 rapid shots that lit up the cabin interior like lightning. Grace heard a scream outside, hit, possibly killed, at least wounded. "Get them to the back room," Mercer shouted. "Now!" Grace grabbed Samuel, started dragging Thomas across the floor. Her back screamed in protest, her swollen belly making everything awkward and slow. She made it to the doorway that led to the cabin's only other space, barely a room, more of a closet with a cot and some storage. Another shot came through the window, this one closer. Wood splintered above Grace's head. She shoved the boys through the doorway, pressed them against the wall. "Stay down," she gasped. "Don't move, don't make a sound." Samuel nodded, eyes huge in his pale face. He wrapped his arms around Thomas, becoming a human shield for his little brother. Grace turned back to the main room. Mercer had moved away from the window, was using the heavy table for cover. 2 more shots punched through the broken glass, one hitting the table with a solid thunk. "How many?" Grace called. "At least 3, maybe 4. Mercer reloaded with practiced speed. "They're spreading out, trying to get angles on the door. What do we do?" "We survive." He glanced at her. "You still got that pistol?" Grace realized she'd dropped it when the window broke. She spotted it near the fireplace, started crawling toward it. A massive impact hit the door. Not a bullet, something heavier. They were trying to break it down. Mercer fired through the door, 2 shots, blind but calculated. The pounding stopped. Someone cursed outside, loud enough to hear. Grace reached the pistol, grabbed it. Another contraction hit, so strong she almost cried out. She pressed her free hand against her mouth, riding it out. The baby was coming. Not tonight. Please not tonight, but soon. "Grace?" Mercer's voice cut through her pain. "You still with me?" "I'm here." "Good. Because if they breach that door, I need you shooting. Understand?" She understood. Understood that this man who'd wanted nothing to do with her was now the only thing standing between her family and death. Understood that her husband's last act had been to send her to someone who might actually be capable of keeping them alive. "I can shoot," she said. The door shuddered again, heavier this time. They were using something as a ram. Mercer moved to the side of the door, rifle ready. "On 3, I open it. You shoot whoever's standing there." Grace positioned herself behind the table, braced the pistol with both hands. Her heart was hammering, but her hands stayed steady. 1, Mercer counted. The door shook. 2. Grace took a breath, held it. 3. Mercer yanked the door open. A man stood on the porch, young and surprised, holding a section of tree trunk they'd been using as a battering ram. He had maybe half a second to register what was happening. Grace shot him in the chest. The man fell backward into the snow. The makeshift ram rolled away. 2 more figures were visible in the storm behind him, already raising their weapons. Mercer slammed the door shut, threw the timber bar back into place. Bullets hammered into the wood from outside, a furious volley that made the whole cabin shake. Then silence. Grace stared at the door, at the holes punched through it, at her own hand still holding the smoking pistol. She'd just killed a man, shot him dead without hesitation, without mercy. She waited to feel something, horror, guilt, anything. All she felt was a grim satisfaction that there was one less man hunting her children. "You did good," Mercer said. He was reloading again, his movements automatic. "Real good. I killed him." "Yes. I've never killed anyone before." "Figured." Mercer moved back to the window, risking a quick look. "But you'll do it again if you have to, won't you?" Grace thought about Samuel's terrified eyes, about Thomas still too cold and sick to understand what was happening. About the baby inside her that deserved a chance to live. Yes, she said, I will. Mercer nodded like she'd passed some kind of test. Then we might actually make it through this. Outside, the storm was building again, wind screaming around the cabin like something alive and furious. The men were still out there, Grace knew, regrouping, planning their next move. They had all night. They had patience and weapons and no reason to give up. But they didn't have what she had. They didn't have two boys sleeping in the back room who needed their mother. They didn't have a baby fighting to be born. They didn't have the cold fury that came from watching your husband die, and knowing the men who killed him thought you'd just lie down and die too. Grace checked her pistol, counted her remaining rounds. 4 left. She'd make them count. The night was just beginning. The body on the porch was already covered in snow by the time the shooting stopped. Grace could see his boot through the broken window, motionless, filling with white. She looked away and found Mercer watching her with an expression she couldn't read. First time gets easier, he said. I don't want it to get easier. Then you're a better person than me. He moved away from the window, started dragging the heavy table toward the door as a barricade. Help me with this. Grace pushed herself up, ignoring the protest in her back and the wet warmth between her legs that might have been blood or birth waters or both. Together they muscled the table against the door. It wasn't much, but it was something solid between them and the men outside. They'll wait now, Mercer said, breathing hard from the effort. Storm's getting worse. They can't risk another rush in the dark. How can you be sure? Because I wouldn't risk it. And whoever's leading them out there isn't stupid. He glanced at the broken window where snow was already accumulating on the sill. We need to board that up before we lose all the heat. They worked in silence, Mercer pulling planks from what looked like a disassembled crate, while Grace held them in place. He hammered nails with quick, efficient strikes, covering the window until only thin lines of firelight leaked through the gaps. The temperature in the cabin had already dropped 10 degrees. From the back room, Grace heard Thomas cough, a wet rattling sound that made her stomach clench. I need to check on him, she said. Mercer nodded, still working. Go. Grace found both boys awake now, huddled together on the cot. Samuel had wrapped every blanket around his brother, leaving himself shivering in just his undershirt and pants. Give me one of those, Grace said gently, taking a blanket and draping it over Samuel's shoulders. You can't help him if you freeze. Is it over? Samuel asked. His voice was small, young in a way that broke her heart. The shooting? For now. Did you kill that man? Grace met her son's eyes, thought about lying, decided he deserved better. Yes. Good. The word came out hard, old. They killed Daddy. Sam, they did. I saw them through the window before we ran. They shot him and then they laughed about it. Samuel's hands were fists in the blanket. So I'm glad you killed one. I hope you kill all of them. Grace wanted to tell him that revenge was wrong, that violence only bred more violence, all the things mothers were supposed to say. But she'd shot a man less than an hour ago and felt nothing but satisfaction. Who was she to lecture her son about anger? Your father, she said instead, wanted us to survive. That's all that matters right now, surviving. Thomas coughed again, harder this time. Grace touched his forehead and swore under her breath. He was burning up. Hypothermia had given way to fever, his body fighting too many battles at once. Stay with him, she told Samuel. Keep him warm. I'll get water. Back in the main room, Mercer had finished boarding up the window and was feeding the fire, building it higher than seemed wise. Grace started to protest about conserving wood, then realized he was burning furniture. The second chair was already kindling. Your boy? He asked without looking up. Fever. Expected. He went too cold too fast. Body's trying to compensate. Mercer straightened, wiping his hands on his pants. There's willow bark in the cabinet. Second shelf. Make him tea. Grace found the bark, started boiling water in a pot Mercer had apparently been using for coffee. Her hands shook as she worked. Exhaustion was catching up to her, or blood loss, or the sheer weight of the last 8 hours. Sit down before you fall down, Mercer said. I'm fine. You're bleeding through your skirt and swaying like a drunk. Sit. Grace lowered herself onto the remaining chair because he was right, and because pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. The baby kicked, a rolling movement that felt different than before. Lower. Harder. Mercer was watching her again with that unreadable expression. How far along are you? 8 months? Maybe a little more. And you walked 5 miles through a blizzard. Didn't have much choice. No, I suppose you didn't. He moved to the cabinet, pulled out a bottle of whiskey that looked older than Grace. When's the last time you ate something that wasn't panic and snow? This morning, before... She stopped. Before Michael died. Before everything ended. Mercer poured whiskey into a tin cup, handed it to her. Drink. Not enough to hurt the baby, but enough to keep you from going into shock. Grace took the cup. The whiskey burned going down, harsh and medicinal. It was the best thing she'd tasted after the stew. Michael talked about you, she said. The words came out before she could stop them. Years ago, when we first married, he said you were the only lawman in Wyoming who couldn't be bought. He was wrong. Everyone can be bought. Mercer sat down across from her, the rifle across his knees. It's just a question of price. What was yours? My life, which I valued more than my principles, as it turned out. His smile was bitter. I could have fought the men who came after me, could have stood my ground, made them kill me in the open where people would ask questions. Instead, I ran to this mountain and spent 15 years pretending the world outside didn't exist. But you let us in. I let your boy in. Stop trying to make me a hero. Grace took another sip of whiskey. The room was warming up again, the boarded window holding back the cold. Outside, the wind had reached a screaming pitch that didn't sound natural, didn't sound like weather at all. Tell me about the documents, Mercer said. Everything Michael found. Grace set down the cup, unbuttoned her coat with stiff fingers. The papers were still there, pressed against her skin, slightly damp with sweat and blood. She pulled them out and spread them on the floor between them. 5 years of theft, reduced to 20 pages of forged signatures and falsified claims. Land deeds for properties that belonged to farmers, miners, ranchers who'd worked their whole lives for what they owned. And every deed had been transferred to shell companies owned by friends of Judge Horace Keene, filed through his court, stamped with his seal. Michael spent 6 months tracking this, Grace said. Started with one suspicious filing, found patterns, cross-referenced names. He stayed late every night at the office, brought work home. I thought, her voice cracked, I thought he was having an affair. Stupid. Not stupid, careful. Mercer was studying the documents, his finger tracing connections. This isn't just corruption. This is organized theft on a scale I've never seen. Keene's made millions. Michael estimated at least $2 million in stolen property. Mercer whistled low. That's enough money to buy silence from here to Washington. That's why he sent me to you. He said the local law couldn't be trusted. Said half the lawmen in the territory were on Keene's payroll. He was probably right. Mercer looked up at her. But I'm not a lawman anymore. I can't arrest anyone, can't prosecute, can't do anything official. You can help me get to Silver Creek. Help me send these to someone who can publish them. And you think publication will bring Keene down? It's all I have. Mercer was quiet for a long moment, studying her face like he was trying to decide something. Finally, he said, There's a newspaper editor in Denver, William Byers. He's honest, or as honest as they come. He published a corruption story about the territorial governor 2 years back, nearly got himself killed for it. Will he publish this? If you can get it to him alive, yes. He doesn't back down from fights. Mercer gathered the papers, handed them back to her. But Denver's 150 miles from here, and between here and there is a whole lot of nothing full of men who want you dead. Grace tucked the documents back inside her coat. Another contraction hit, stronger than before. She breathed through it, counted to 15 this time. The baby was definitely coming. Maybe not tonight, but soon. A day, maybe 2. I can't think about 150 miles right now, she said when she could speak again. I can barely think about the next 5 minutes. Fair enough. Mercer stood, moved to the fire. The willow bark should be ready. Grace made the tea, brought it back to the small room where Thomas lay shivering despite the blankets. Samuel helped her lift his brother's head while she coaxed the bitter liquid past his lips. Thomas gagged, coughed, but swallowed. Within minutes, his shivering eased. Is he going to die? Samuel asked. Direct, blunt, needing truth. Not if I can help it, Grace said. It wasn't a promise, but it was the best she could offer. She stayed with the boys until they both drifted back into an uneasy sleep, then returned to the main room. Mercer was at the boarded window again, ear pressed against the wood. Anything? Grace asked. Movement. Maybe 50 yards out. They're still there. What are they waiting for? Dawn. Better visibility. Or for us to make a mistake. He turned to face her. How much ammunition do you have? Grace checked the pistol. 4 rounds. I've got maybe 20 for the rifle, another dozen for the shotgun. That's not enough for a sustained fight. Then what do? We make them think we have more than we do. We make them cautious. Mercer's eyes were calculating, tactical. And we pray the storm keeps them pinned long enough for us to figure something else out. Grace wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. They were trapped in a cabin with limited ammunition, being hunted by professional killers, and she was about to give birth any minute. Prayer seemed inadequate. Your husband, Mercer said suddenly, when he sent you to me. Did he say anything else? Grace tried to remember those last moments. Michael's face pale in the snow, his words coming out in gasps. He said you were the only honest man he ever knew, said you'd help because it was the right thing to do. He had more faith in me than I deserve. Maybe, or maybe he saw something you don't. Mercer turned away, uncomfortable with the praise. Get some rest. I'll keep watch. I can help. You can barely stand. Rest while you can. Dawn's going to come whether we're ready for it or not. Grace wanted to argue, but exhaustion was pulling at her like a riptide. She made it to the bed in the corner, sat down heavily. The mattress was thin and lumpy, but felt like heaven. She meant to stay awake, to help keep watch, to be useful. Instead, she was asleep within seconds, falling into darkness like a stone into water. She dreamed of Michael, not dying mercifully, but alive and young, back when they'd first met. He was showing her a map, pointing to places they'd travel someday, cities and mountains and oceans they'd see together. In the dream, she tried to tell him it wouldn't happen, that he'd die before any of those dreams came true. But he just smiled and kissed her forehead and said, "Then you'll have to see them for both of us." Grace woke to silence, the kind of silence that meant the wind had finally died. She sat up too fast, head spinning. The cabin was dim, the fire burned down to coals. Mercer was still at the window, unmoved, rifle ready. How long had she slept? Storm's breaking, he said without turning around. Another hour, maybe 2, and it'll be clear enough to see. Grace stood on shaking legs, moved to check on the boys. They were both still asleep, Thomas's fever broken, his breathing easier. Small mercies. When she returned to the main room, Mercer was pouring coffee from a pot she hadn't heard him make. He handed her a cup without asking if she wanted it. You talk in your sleep, he said. Grace's face heated. What did I say? Mostly your husband's name, and you apologized a lot. He took a sip of his own coffee. For what it's worth, you don't have anything to apologize for. I got him killed. No. Horace Keene got him killed. Michael made a choice to expose corruption knowing it might cost him. That's not on you. He made that choice for me, for the boys. He wanted us to have a better world. Then help me keep you alive long enough to give them one. Mercer set down his cup. Because in about an hour, those men outside are going to make their move, and I need you sharp. Grace drank the coffee, bitter and strong. It cleared her head, pushed back the exhaustion. What's the plan? We let them think we're weaker than we are. We make them overconfident. Mercer moved to the door, started pulling away the table barricade. And then we hit them harder than they expect. That's not much of the plan. It's what we've got. The sky was starting to lighten through the gaps in the boarded window, a gray pre-dawn glow that turned the snow outside into something ghostly. Grace could hear sounds now that the wind had died. Voices, low and distant. The scrape of boots on frozen ground. They were getting ready. Mercer checked his rifle one more time, then handed Grace the shotgun. You ever fire one of these? Once. My father taught me when I was 16. It kicks like a mule. Brace it against your shoulder, or it'll knock you flat. He showed her how to reload, how to hold it properly. 2 shots, then you're empty. Make them count. Grace took the weapon, heavy and real in her hands. The baby kicked, hard enough that she gasped. You all right? Mercer asked. Fine. Just... Another contraction, building slow. Just the baby reminding me it exists. Mercer's eyes widened slightly. You're in labor. Not yet. Soon. How soon? I don't know. Hours? Maybe longer. Grace breathed through the contraction, waited for it to pass. Doesn't matter. Those men aren't going to wait for me to give birth before they attack. This is insane. You should be in a bed with a doctor, not... But I'm not. I'm here, in your cabin, about to fight for my life. So let's stop talking about what should be and deal with what is. Mercer stared at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, something like respect crossing his face. Michael chose well when he married you. He chose poorly when he trusted honest judges and fair courts. Grace moved to the window, peered through a gap in the boards. She could see shapes now in the growing light. 3 men, maybe 4, positioned around the cabin in a loose circle. They're surrounding us. Expected. They'll try to pin us down, keep us from running. Mercer was moving around the cabin now, checking sight lines, calculating angles. When they come, they'll hit the door and the window simultaneously. Standard assault. How do you know? Because it's what I do. He glanced at her. You remember what I said about center mass? Yes. I meant it. Don't aim for anything fancy, just point and shoot. The shotgun will do the rest. From outside, a voice called out. Different from before, older, with an authority that suggested leadership. You in the cabin, this is your last chance. Send out the woman and the papers, and we'll let the children live. Grace felt her hands tighten on the shotgun. They thought they could bargain, thought she'd trade herself for her boys. Don't answer, Mercer said quietly. Come on now, the voice continued. Be reasonable. We don't want to hurt those kids. Grace moved before she could think, pushed past Mercer to the door, yanked it open 6 inches. The cold air hit her like a slap. 4 men stood in a rough semicircle around the cabin. She'd been right about the number. The leader was standing center, maybe 40 years old, dressed too well for hunting through blizzards. The kind of man who got paid enough to dress well. My children stay with me, Grace called out. Her voice was steady, strong. And the papers go where they need to go. Those are the only terms. The man's face hardened. Then you've chosen poorly, Mrs. Holloway. No, Grace said. You chose poorly when you murdered my husband. She slammed the door shut, threw the bar back into place. Mercer was staring at her like she'd lost her mind. What the hell was that? He demanded. That was me making them angry. Angry people make mistakes. Angry people also shoot straighter when they're motivated. Then we better be ready. They didn't have to wait long. Less than a minute after Grace closed the door, the attack came. It started with gunfire, a volley that punched through the boarded window and hammered the door. Grace hit the floor, covering her head. Mercer was already moving, firing back through gaps in the boards with precise, measured shots. Then the door exploded inward. Not fully, but enough. The top hinge shattered under concentrated fire, leaving the door hanging at an angle. Grace could see daylight through the gap, could see movement outside. The shotgun, Mercer shouted. Now! Grace rolled to her knees, brought the weapon up. A man was trying to force his way through the damaged door, using it as cover while he worked. She didn't think, just aimed and fired. The blast was deafening. The kick nearly knocked her backward despite Mercer's warning, but the shot caught the man square in the chest, threw him back into the snow, 2 down. Mercer was still firing through the window, keeping the others pinned. Grace could hear them shouting to each other, coordinating. They were good, professional, but they hadn't expected resistance this fierce from a pregnant woman and a retired lawman. Another contraction hit Grace hard enough to double her over. She gasped, tried to breathe through it. Too soon. The baby was coming too soon. Grace! Mercer's voice, sharp with concern. I'm fine, she managed. Keep shooting. But she wasn't fine. The contractions were coming faster now, harder. 5 minutes apart, maybe less. Her body had decided this was happening regardless of the gunfight happening around her. A shadow moved past the broken window. Grace saw it from the corner of her eye, raised the shotgun with shaking hands. But before she could fire, glass shattered in the back room. They'd found another window. Samuel, Grace screamed. She tried to stand, stumbled. Mercer caught her arm, steadied her. Go, he said. I've got this. Grace ran, or tried to. More of a desperate stumble toward the back room where her boys were. She could hear sounds of struggle, Samuel's voice high and terrified. She burst through the doorway to find a man climbing through the small window, already halfway inside. Samuel was backed into the corner, Thomas clutched behind him, both boys frozen with fear. The man saw Grace, started to bring his pistol around. She fired the shotgun's second barrel from 5 feet away. The man's body jerked backward, hung half in and half out of the window for a moment, then slid out into the snow. Blood splattered the wall, the floor. Samuel and Thomas stared at their mother with wide, shocked eyes. "It's okay," Grace heard herself saying. The words sounded distant, wrong. "It's okay. I've got you." But it wasn't okay. Another contraction tore through her, so violent she cried out. Her legs gave way. She fell to her knees, still holding the empty shotgun. Samuel was there instantly, his small hands on her shoulders. "Mama, Mama." "I'm all right," Grace lied. "I just need—" Water gushed down her legs, warm and viscous. Her water had broken. The baby was coming now, not in hours or days. Now. From the main room, she heard Mercer's rifle fire 3 more times in quick succession, then silence. "Grace!" His voice, urgent. "They're pulling back! We drove them off!" Grace tried to answer, couldn't. Another contraction, building and building until she couldn't breathe through it. She heard herself making sounds, animal sounds she'd never made before. Mercer appeared in the doorway, took one look at her, and went pale. "Oh, hell!" "The baby's coming," Grace gasped when she could speak. "Now. Right now." He stood frozen for maybe 3 seconds. Then something in his face changed, hardened into grim determination. "Samuel, get every clean cloth you can find. Thomas, bring me water from the kettle. Move." The boys scattered to obey. Mercer knelt beside Grace, his hands already reaching for her. "This is going to be bad. You know that, right?" "I've had 3 children. I know. Not with a retired lawman for a midwife, you haven't." His attempt at humor fell flat, but Grace appreciated the effort. "Can you make it to the bed?" "I don't think so." "Then we do it here." He started pulling blankets down from the cot, making a rough nest on the floor. "When's the last time you did this?" 6 years ago. You?" "Never." Mercer helped her onto the blankets, positioned her as gently as his rough hands could manage. "But I helped birth a calf once. Figure the principle's the same." Grace might have laughed if another contraction hadn't hit. She gripped Mercer's arm hard enough to leave bruises, rode it out. Samuel returned with cloth torn from what looked like Mercer's only spare shirt. Thomas brought water in a chipped basin. Both boys stood at the edges of the room, uncertain and terrified. "It's going to be all right," Grace told them. She had no idea if that was true. "You're going to have a new brother or sister soon." "Is it supposed to hurt like this?" Samuel asked, his voice small. "Yes," Grace said honestly. "It is." Mercer had rolled up his sleeves, was washing his hands in the water with the focused intensity of a man preparing for battle. "Boys, I need you to stay back. Give your mother room." Outside, through the broken window, Grace could hear the men regrouping. They'd pulled back, but they hadn't left. They were waiting, watching, probably trying to figure out their next move. She had to get this baby out before they attacked again. Another contraction, the strongest yet. Grace felt her body bearing down, instinct taking over. She grabbed Mercer's shoulder, held on. "That's it," he said quietly. His voice had gone steady, calm. "You're doing fine." "I'm dying." "You're not dying. You're fighting. Big difference." His hands were on her now, checking, assessing. "Baby's coming fast, faster than I expected." "How fast?" "Next few contractions, maybe." He looked up at her, and for the first time since they'd met, she saw something soft in those hard eyes. "I need you to push when I tell you. Can you do that?" Grace nodded. She didn't have breath for words anymore. The next contraction built like a wave, enormous and unstoppable. Mercer's voice cut through it, steady and sure. "Now, Grace, push now." She pushed, felt something give inside her, felt the baby moving. Pain exploded through her, white-hot and all-consuming. "Good," Mercer said. "Again. One more." Grace gathered everything she had left, every ounce of strength, and pushed again. The world narrowed to just this moment, this effort, this single impossible task. And then suddenly the pressure released, and she heard crying. Not her own. A baby's cry, thin and outraged and perfect. "It's a girl," Mercer said. His voice was rough, choked. "You've got a daughter." Through tears and exhaustion, Grace saw him holding a tiny, blood-covered infant. He was cradling her like she might break, this hard man who'd spent 15 years alone on a mountain, suddenly gentle as snow. "Let me—" Grace reached out with shaking hands. Mercer placed the baby on her chest, helped her wrap the infant in clean cloth. The baby was so small, so impossibly fragile, but she was breathing, crying, alive. Samuel and Thomas crept closer, staring at their new sister with a mixture of awe and confusion. "She's really small," Thomas said. "She'll grow," Grace promised. She couldn't stop touching the baby's face, her tiny hands. "She's a fighter." From outside, a gunshot cracked the morning air. A warning, or maybe just impatience. The moment shattered. Reality came crashing back. They were still trapped, still being hunted. And now Grace had a newborn daughter who wouldn't survive an hour in the cold if they had to run. Mercer was thinking the same thing. She could see it in his face. "We can't stay here," he said quietly. "The cabin's compromised. Too many holes in the walls, not enough ammunition." "I can't walk, not yet." "I know." He looked at the baby, then at Grace, then at the two boys huddled together. "But we're out of options. They're going to come again, and when they do, we won't be able to hold them off." "So what do we do?" Mercer stood, moved to the window, looked out at the men waiting in the snow. When he turned back, his face was set with a decision Grace could see had cost him something. "I'll draw them off," he said. "Lead them away from the cabin. Give you time to rest, to get strong enough to make it to Silver Creek on your own." "That's suicide." "Maybe, but it's the only way to keep them alive." He nodded at her children. "And I'd rather die on my feet than watch them kill a baby in front of me." Grace stared at him. This man who'd opened his door against his better judgment, who'd fought beside her, who'd just delivered her daughter with his own hands. This stranger who'd become the only thing standing between her family and death. "Michael was right about you," she said. "Michael was an idealistic fool." "Maybe. But he knew what matters when it counts." Grace shifted the baby in her arms, met Mercer's eyes. "And so do you." Outside, the men were moving again, getting ready for another assault. Time was running out. Mercer checked his rifle, his pistol, started gathering what ammunition remained. He moved with the efficiency of a man who'd made peace with dying. "Wait until they're gone," he told her. "Then run. Don't look back, don't stop. Just run." "Cole—" His name felt strange on her tongue, but right. "Thank you." He paused at the doorway, looked back at her one last time. The retired lawman who'd tried to hide from the world, who'd almost succeeded until a desperate woman knocked on his door in the middle of a blizzard. "Tell your daughter," he said quietly, "that she was born during a storm and came out fighting. Tell her that's what Holloway women do." Then he was gone, out the door and into the gray morning light, and Grace heard gunfire erupt in the distance as he drew the killers away from her children. She held her newborn daughter close, felt Samuel and Thomas press against her sides. The cabin fell quiet except for the baby's soft breathing and the distant sound of battle moving through the trees. And Grace understood with perfect clarity that she would survive this, that she would make it to Silver Creek, send those documents to Denver, bring down Judge Keene and his empire of theft, not because she was strong, but because Cole Mercer had just traded his life for hers, and she would not let that sacrifice be for nothing. The baby stirred against her chest, already searching for milk, already demanding life. "All right," Grace whispered to her children. "We rest for 1 hour, then we walk." Grace didn't get her hour. She got maybe 20 minutes before the gunfire stopped echoing through the trees, and silence fell like a guillotine blade. The kind of silence that meant someone was dead or dying, and she had a terrible suspicion she knew which. The baby nursed at her breast, already figuring out how to survive. Grace held her with one arm while using the other to push herself upright against the wall. Her body screamed in protest, every muscle torn and bleeding and exhausted. She ignored it. "Mama, you shouldn't—" Samuel started. "Help me stand," Grace cut him off. "Now." Samuel and Thomas got on either side of her, their small shoulders taking her weight as she hauled herself to her feet. The room spun. She breathed through it, waited for the dizziness to pass. It didn't, not really, but she could function through it. She'd walked 5 miles through a blizzard in labor. She could damn well stand up. Through the broken window in the main room, she could hear voices. Men talking, not shouting, conversational, almost. That was worse than gunfire. That meant they'd won whatever fight Mercer had tried to give them. Grace moved to the doorway, peered into the main room. The cabin looked like a war zone in daylight. Bullet holes punched through walls. Blood on the floor where she'd shot the man who'd tried to come through the door. The barricaded window letting in thin strips of gray morning light. And through one of those strips, she could see movement outside. 2 men, maybe 3, circling back toward the cabin. They were coming to finish it. Grace looked down at the baby in her arms. Her daughter. She hadn't even named her yet, hadn't had time to think of anything beyond keeping her alive for the next minute. The infant's eyes were closed, her tiny mouth working even in sleep, completely helpless, completely dependent on a mother who could barely stand. "Samuel?" Grace said quietly. "The shotgun. Is it loaded?" "No, Mama. You used both shells." "The pistol, then. Where is it?" Samuel ran to find it, came back with the weapon Grace had dropped when her water broke. She checked the chamber with one hand, keeping the baby secured with the other. 3 rounds left. Better than nothing, worse than she needed. From outside, a voice called out. The same leader from before, the well-dressed killer who'd tried to bargain. "Mrs. Holloway, your friend is dead. There's no one left to help you now." Grace's heart clenched, but she pushed the grief down, buried it somewhere deep where it couldn't cripple her. Mercer was dead. Fine. She'd mourn him later, if there was a later. Right now, she had 3 bullets and 3 children who needed her functional. "Come out with the papers," the voice continued. "Make this easy on yourself." Grace moved to the broken window, staying low, keeping out of sight. She could see them now. 3 men left, spread out in a loose triangle around the cabin. The leader in front, 2 others flanking. Professional positions, good coverage. These weren't amateurs who'd panic if she shot one. But 3 men meant she'd killed 2. Mercer had killed at least 1, maybe 2. That was something. They'd cut the hunting party in half. "What do we do?" Samuel whispered. He'd followed her to the window, Thomas right behind him. Both boys trying to be brave, trying not to cry. "We fight," Grace said. Simple. True. "And we don't give up." "But there's 3 of them and only 1 of you." Grace looked at her oldest son, saw Michael in his face. The same stubborn jaw, the same eyes that saw the world as it should be instead of how it was. "There's 4 of us," she corrected. "You, me, Thomas, and your sister. We're a family. That counts for something." "Can I have a gun?" Samuel asked. "No." "But, no." Grace shifted the baby to her other arm, wincing at the pain between her legs. She was still bleeding, probably more than was safe, but she could bleed after. "I need you and Thomas to go to the back room. Get under the cot. Don't come out no matter what you hear." "I want to help." "You are helping. You're keeping your brother and sister safe while I handle this." Grace touched his face with her free hand. "That's the most important job there is." Samuel looked like he wanted to argue more, but Thomas tugged on his sleeve and he went. Grace watched them disappear into the back room, heard the scrape of the cot as they pulled it into position. Good boys, brave boys. They deserved better than this. The baby stirred, made a small sound. Grace looked down at her daughter's face, memorizing it in case these were the last minutes she had. No name yet. Maybe she'd die nameless. Maybe they all would. "Your father would know what to call you," Grace whispered. "He was good with words. Good with everything, really, except staying alive." Outside, she heard footsteps crunching in snow. They were moving in, done with talking. Grace positioned herself behind the remains of the table Mercer had used as a barricade. It wouldn't stop bullets, but it might slow them down, make them hesitate. She laid the baby on the floor beside her, wrapped tight in cloth, then gripped the pistol with both hands. The door exploded inward. Not from battering this time, from an actual explosive. Someone had packed something against the base and blown it straight off its hinges. The blast was enormous, deafening. Grace felt the concussion in her chest, felt debris rain down on her head. When her vision cleared, there was a man-sized hole where the door used to be. Smoke rolled through it, acrid and choking. And through the smoke came the first man, rifle raised, sweeping the room. Grace shot him in the throat. The man went down gurgling, clutching his neck. Blood sprayed between his fingers. He was still alive, still moving, but out of the fight. 2 left. The second man came through the hole fast, combat trained, already shooting. Bullets chewed through the table Grace was hiding behind. She rolled left, came up in a crouch, fired again. The shot went wide, punched through the wall behind the man. He pivoted toward her, and Grace saw his face clearly for the first time. Young, maybe 25. Scared despite the training. He was just a kid doing a job. She shot him in the chest anyway. He staggered back, hit the wall, slid down, leaving a red streak. His rifle clattered to the floor. He tried to say something, blood bubbling at his lips, then stopped moving. One bullet left. One man still outside. Grace's hands were shaking now, adrenaline and blood loss making everything distant and sharp at the same time. The baby was crying, high and desperate. She'd need to nurse again soon, needed comfort and warmth and all the things Grace couldn't give her in the middle of a firefight. "Impressive," the leader's voice called from outside. "I'll admit, I underestimated you, Mrs. Holloway." Grace didn't answer. She was trying to figure out where he was, where he'd come from. The man was smart enough not to follow his companions through the smoking hole. "But it's over now," he continued. "You're out of bullets. I can hear it in your breathing. You're hurt, exhausted, bleeding out. Let me help you." "Your kind of help killed my husband," Grace called back. Her voice sounded stronger than she felt. "Your husband made poor choices, but your children don't have to pay for them. Send out the papers, and I'll let you all walk away." "You're lying." "Perhaps, but what choice do you have?" Grace looked at the pistol in her hand. "One round. No time to search the bodies for more ammunition, and even if she found some, she didn't know if she could load it before he attacked. The baby was still crying, getting louder. Any minute now, Samuel might come running from the back room to help, and then they'd all die together. She made a decision. "All right," she called out. "You win. I'm coming out." Silence from outside. He was deciding whether to believe her. "Leave the gun," he finally said. "Just you and the papers. Hands where I can see them." Grace set the pistol down carefully, then picked up the baby. Her daughter was red-faced from crying, tiny fists waving. Grace tucked her back inside her coat, where it was warm, then reached for the documents that had cost Michael his life. She stood on shaking legs, started walking toward the hole where the door used to be. Every step was agony. She was leaving a trail of blood on the floor, dripping steady and thick. Definitely too much blood. But she kept walking. Through the hole, she could see gray sky and snow. The leader was standing maybe 20 feet away, pistol drawn, but not aimed. Confident. He thought he'd won. Grace stepped through the opening into the cold morning air. The wind had died completely now, leaving everything still and frozen. She could see Mercer's body in the distance, sprawled in the snow. He'd made it maybe 100 yards before they'd brought him down. "The papers," the man said, extending his free hand. Grace reached into her coat like she was going for the documents. Her fingers closed around something else instead. The pistol she'd tucked into her belt while his view was blocked by the wall. The one Samuel had brought her. The empty one. But he didn't know that. She pulled it out and fired. Click. Empty chamber. But the man flinched, ducked, his own weapon coming up defensive instead of offensive. Grace was already moving, throwing herself sideways behind the corner of the cabin. She hit the ground hard, covering the baby with her body. Shots hammered into the wood where she'd been standing. Grace rolled, came up running. Not away from the cabin, toward it. Toward the side window she knew was there, the one that opened into the small back room where her boys were hiding. More shots. One clipped her shoulder, a line of fire across her coat. She stumbled but didn't fall. "Samuel!" she screamed. "The rifle! Throw me the rifle!" She hit the wall beneath the window, pressed against it. Above her she heard scrambling inside. "Please let him understand. Please let him find it. Please!" The rifle came flying through the window, landed in the snow beside her. Grace grabbed it, checked the chamber. Mercer had left one round in it. One last chance. The leader came around the corner fast, his pistol already raised. He saw her at the same time she saw him, both of them on the ground, both bringing weapons to bear. Grace fired first. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder. The shot was rushed, panicked, fired from a prone position while holding a baby inside her coat. It should have missed. It didn't. The bullet caught this man high in the chest, spun him around. He fell backward into the snow, his pistol flying from his hand. Grace heard him gasping, choking on blood. She pushed herself up, walked over to where he lay. He was still alive, barely. His eyes found hers, wide with shock and pain. You were supposed to be easy, he managed. Blood ran from his mouth. Scared mother, 3 children, easy. I'm a scared mother, Grace said. Her voice was flat, empty. That's what makes me dangerous. She wanted to shoot him again, to make absolutely sure he was dead. But the rifle was empty and she was out of bullets, and anyway he was dying on his own. She could see it in the way his breathing was getting shallow and how the light was leaving his eyes. So instead she turned away, started walking back toward the cabin. Her shoulder burned where the bullet had grazed her. Her legs were barely holding her weight. The baby had stopped crying, gone quiet in that way infants did when they sense danger. Behind her, she heard the man make one last wet sound, then nothing. Grace made it to the blown-out doorway, stepped through into the smoke-filled cabin. Samuel and Thomas were emerging from the back room, their faces streaked with tears and dirt. Is it over? Samuel asked. His voice broke on the last word. It's over, Grace said. Then her legs gave out completely and she fell, protecting the baby with the last of her strength as darkness pulled at the edges of her vision. She came to with Thomas's hand on her face, patting her cheek. Mama, please wake up. Grace opened her eyes. She was lying on the floor of the cabin, the baby somehow still secure in her arms. Both boys were kneeling beside her, terrified. I'm all right, she lied. Help me sit up. Together they got her upright, propped against the wall. The cabin looked even worse from this angle. Bodies on the floor, blood everywhere, holes in the walls letting in cold air. The explosion had taken out half the roof over the main room, exposing charred beams to the gray sky. They couldn't stay here. The cabin was destroyed, and even if it wasn't, more men might come. Keene had money and connections. He could send a dozen more killers if these failed to report back. We need to leave, Grace said. Where? Samuel asked. Silver Creek. It's the only place with a telegraph. Grace looked down at the baby, still unnamed, still fighting for every breath in the cold air. We need to send these documents before anyone else dies for them. But Mama, you can't walk. I can walk. Grace pulled herself to her feet using the wall for support. The room spun but settled. I have to. She moved through the cabin, gathering what she could. A blanket for the baby. A coat from one of the dead men. She tried not to think about that, just took it because it was warm and her own was ruined. Food from Mercer's cabinet, what little there was. A canteen. In the corner, she found Mercer's rifle, the one he'd carried when he went out to draw the killers away. She picked it up, felt its weight, checked the ammunition pouch attached to the strap. Empty. He'd fired every round he had trying to save them. Grace slung the rifle over her shoulder anyway. Maybe she'd find bullets in Silver Creek, maybe she wouldn't. Either way, it felt right to carry it. Is Mr. Mercer really dead? Thomas asked quietly. Grace looked out through the broken window at the body in the distance. Yes. Was he a good man? Yes, Grace said. He was. Then why did he die and the bad men got to live for so long? It was the kind of question that didn't have a good answer, the kind that made you question everything you thought you knew about fairness and justice. Grace knelt down so she was eye level with her youngest son. Sometimes good people die, she said, and sometimes bad people live a long time. That's not fair and it's not right, but Mr. Mercer didn't die for nothing. He died so we could live, and now we have to make that mean something. Thomas nodded like he understood, even though he was 6 years old and couldn't possibly understand. But he was trying, and that was enough. Grace stood again, adjusted the baby in her arms. We walk slow. We stop when we need to. But we don't stop moving forward. Understand? Both boys nodded. They left through the blown-out doorway, stepping over bodies and debris. The morning was fully light now, the sky gray and heavy with the promise of more snow. Grace turned her back on the cabin, on Mercer's body, on everything that had happened in the last 12 hours. Silver Creek was 15 miles southeast. She'd walked 5 miles through a blizzard last night in active labor. Surely she could manage 15 more. They made it maybe 200 yards before Grace had to stop. The pain between her legs was excruciating, and she was still bleeding badly. Too badly. She knew enough about childbirth to know that this much blood meant something was wrong inside, something tearing that shouldn't be. Mama? Samuel was watching her with worried eyes. I'm fine. Just need a minute. But she wasn't fine. She was dying, slowly but certainly. The blood loss, the exhaustion, the trauma of everything her body had been through, it was too much. Even if they made it to Silver Creek, she might not live to see the documents sent. Grace looked down at her daughter, still nameless, still depending on her for everything. Then at her sons, both trying so hard to be brave. She couldn't die. Not yet. Not until the papers were sent. Not until Keene was exposed. Not until her children were somewhere safe. So she started walking again. They covered maybe a mile in the first hour. Grace counted her steps, focused on putting one foot in front of the other. The baby needed to nurse, and she stopped to let her, sitting on a fallen log while the boys kept watch. Her milk was coming in thin and slow, her body too damaged to produce much, but it was enough to keep the infant quiet. "What's her name?" Samuel asked, watching the baby nurse. Grace realized she still hadn't named her daughter. Every time she tried to think of something, her mind went blank. Nothing felt right for a child born in blood and violence, a child who'd entered the world fighting. "I don't know yet," Grace admitted. "What do you think we should call her?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment. "Hope? That's too easy, too obvious. But it's true, isn't it? She's the reason we're still going." Grace looked at her daughter's face, scrunched up and red as she ate. Samuel was right. This tiny creature was Hope, whether Grace wanted to be that sentimental about it or not. "Hope," she repeated. "All right, Hope Holloway." "Hope Mercer Holloway," Samuel corrected quietly. Grace felt something crack in her chest. She nodded, couldn't speak for a moment. "Yes? Hope Mercer Holloway." They walked on. The second mile was harder than the first, the third harder than the second. Grace's legs were barely responding anymore, moving on memory and stubbornness. She'd tied a strip of cloth between her legs to slow the bleeding, but it was soaked through within an hour. Around midday, Thomas started lagging behind. Grace stopped to check on him and realized his fever was back, worse than before. His skin was burning up despite the cold. "Can you keep walking?" she asked him. He nodded, but she could see it was a lie. The boy was running on fumes. "Samuel, help your brother. Let him lean on you." They continued like that, 3 children and a dying mother, stumbling through the snow. Grace had lost track of how far they'd come, how far they had left to go. Everything hurt now, not just her legs or her shoulder or the wound between her legs, but everything. Her bones, her skin, her lungs. Breathing was work. Seeing was work. Existing was work. But she kept moving. The sun was starting to set. Had they really been walking all day? When Grace saw it. Smoke rising in the distance, multiple columns, buildings, Silver Creek. "There," she gasped, pointing. "Just a little further." But her body had other plans. The moment she saw the town, the moment she knew they might actually make it, everything that had been holding her together came apart. Her legs folded. She went down hard, barely managing to twist so she landed on her side instead of on Hope. Mama! Samuel was there instantly, trying to help her up. "I can't," Grace heard herself saying. The words came out slurred, wrong. "Can't get up." "You have to. We're almost there. Take the baby." Grace fumbled with the coat, trying to pull Hope free. "Take her and your brother and go to the telegraph office. Send the papers to—" What was the name? She knew it a minute ago. "Denver. William Byers in Denver." "I can't leave you here. You have to." Grace finally got Hope free, pressed her into Samuel's arms. "Take the papers. In my coat. Get them to the telegraph operator. Tell them to send everything to Byers. He'll know what to do." Samuel was crying now, tears streaming down his 9-year-old face. "Mama, please." "You're strong enough," Grace said. "I know you are. Your father knew it too. That's why he—" She lost the thought, couldn't remember what Michael had known or hadn't known. Everything was getting fuzzy. "Mama, don't go to sleep." But Grace was already going, sliding down into darkness that felt warm and soft after so much cold and pain. She heard Samuel calling her name, felt Thomas's small hand on her face. Then nothing. She woke to voices, hands lifting her. Grace tried to fight, thought it was Keene's men come back to finish her, but these hands were gentle, and the voices were saying things like "careful" and "she's lost a lot of blood." "The baby," Grace tried to say. "My boys, they're safe," a woman's voice said. "Your son got them to town, got the papers sent. You did it, honey. You won. Now stop trying to talk and let us help you." Grace tried to ask more questions, but her tongue wouldn't work. She felt herself being carried, felt warmth surrounding her. A bed, soft and clean, blankets, something hot pressed to her lips, and she drank without tasting it. Then darkness again, deep and total. When she woke the second time, it was to daylight streaming through a window and the sound of a baby crying. Grace's body tried to respond, maternal instinct pulling her toward consciousness. She forced her eyes open. She was in a small room, clean and spare. A doctor's office, maybe, or someone's spare bedroom. The baby, Hope, was in a wooden crate being used as a makeshift cradle, crying that angry newborn cry that demanded attention immediately. Grace tried to sit up and nearly screamed. Everything hurt worse than before, if that was possible. Easy now. The woman from before appeared, older with gray streaks in her dark hair. You tore up inside something fierce. Doctor says you're lucky to be alive. My boys, right outside, eating stew and probably making themselves sick on it. They're fine. The woman lifted Hope from the crate, brought her to Grace. She needs to nurse, and you need to let her. Doctor's orders. Grace took her daughter, got her positioned. Hope latched on fierce and hungry, and Grace felt the tug of connection, biological and deeper. The papers, she managed. Did they? Sent to Denver 3 hours ago. Every page. Your boy made sure of it, stood there watching the operator send every word. The woman smiled. Whole town's talking about it. Judge Horace Keene and his land scheme. By tomorrow, it'll be in every newspaper from here to Washington. Grace closed her eyes, felt something release in her chest. They'd done it. Michael's evidence was out, beyond Keene's reach. The judge would fall, his stolen empire would crumble, and maybe her husband hadn't died for nothing. What's your name? Grace asked the woman. Martha Preston. I run the boarding house here in Silver Creek. Your boys are staying in my spare room until you're well enough to travel. Thank you. Don't thank me. Thank that boy of yours. 9 years old, and he carried his baby sister a mile through snow while dragging his sick brother behind him. Got to my door and wouldn't let anyone touch the baby or the papers until he knew his mama was being cared for. Martha shook her head. That's a good boy you raised. His father raised him, Grace said quietly. I just kept him alive. Sometimes that's enough. Grace looked down at Hope, nursing steadily now. Then out the window where she could see Samuel and Thomas sitting on a porch, eating from bowls with the focused intensity of children who'd been hungry too long. They'd survived. All of them. Against odds that should have killed them, they'd survived. And Cole Mercer was dead on a mountain, buried under snow, alone in a cabin that was falling apart around his body. Grace started to cry. Not gentle tears, but deep, racking sobs that shook her whole body and made Hope pull away from nursing to cry in sympathy. She cried for Michael, shot down in his own yard. For Mercer, who died trying to save strangers he didn't even want in his house. For herself, torn apart and bleeding and still somehow breathing. For her children, who'd seen things no child should see. Martha held her while she cried, didn't tell her it was all right or that things would get better, just held her and let her break because breaking was necessary sometimes. When Grace finally stopped, when there were no more tears left, she felt hollow and clean, scoured out, ready to rebuild. How long until I can travel? She asked. Doctor says 2 weeks minimum, maybe 3. I don't have 3 weeks. Keene will send more men when these don't come back. Keene's problems aren't in Silver Creek anymore, Martha said grimly. They're in Denver and Washington and every town between here and there. By the time his men figure out what happened, you'll be long gone. Grace wanted to believe that, wanted to think they'd won completely, that the fight was over. But she'd learned in the last day that safety was an illusion. The danger could come through your door any minute, no matter how careful you were. Where will you go? Martha asked. Grace hadn't thought about it. Beyond getting the papers sent, beyond surviving, she hadn't let herself think about what came after. I don't know, she admitted. Somewhere Keene can't find us. Somewhere my children can grow up without looking over their shoulders. There's no such place, Martha said, not unkindly. But you'll find somewhere close enough. You're a survivor, Grace Holloway. I can see it in you. Grace looked at her daughter, at her sons visible through the window. I'm a mother, she corrected. It's not the same thing. Sometimes it is. Hope had fallen asleep mid-feeding, milk-drunk and content. Grace held her close, breathed in that new baby smell that was the same whether you gave birth in a hospital or on a cabin floor with bullets flying. 3 days later, word came from Denver. The story had broken. Judge Horace Keene had been arrested at his home, caught trying to burn documents. Federal marshals had seized his records, his properties, everything. The corruption was bigger than even Michael had suspected. Dozens of officials involved, hundreds of properties stolen, millions of dollars in theft. And Grace's testimony, sent by telegraph and confirmed by the documents, was the key to all of it. 2 weeks after that, Grace was strong enough to travel. Not healed, she'd carry the scars from Hope's birth for the rest of her life, but functional. Martha helped her and the children onto a stage, heading south, away from Wyoming and everything that had happened there. Before they left, Grace asked one favor. "When the snow melts," she told Martha, "will you send someone to Black Ridge, to Cole Mercer's cabin? To bury him proper." "Yes, and to mark the grave. He deserves that much." Martha promised she would. Grace didn't know if she'd keep that promise, but she chose to believe it anyway. The stage pulled away from Silver Creek on a cold morning in late February. Grace held Hope in her lap while Samuel and Thomas pressed against the window, watching the town disappear. They were heading to her sister's place in Colorado, a farm outside Denver where they could stay until Grace figured out what came next. She had $63 to her name, 3 children to feed, and wounds that might never fully heal. But she had the documents safe in Denver, had the satisfaction of knowing Keene would rot in prison, had the knowledge that her children had learned what it meant to fight when fighting was the only option left. It wasn't much, but it was enough to build on. Hope stirred in her arms, made the small sounds that meant she'd wake hungry in a few minutes. Grace looked down at her daughter's face, saw Michael in the shape of her nose, saw Mercer in the stubborn set of her jaw, saw herself in the way the baby's fists were already clenched like she was ready for a fight. "Your name is Hope Mercer Holloway," Grace whispered, "and you were born in fire and blood and gunpowder. Don't you ever forget that. Don't you ever let anyone tell you that you can't survive what you've already survived." The baby didn't answer, just kept sleeping the deep sleep of the innocent and protected. Grace held her close and watched the mountains fade into the distance, leaving behind the cabin and the bodies, and the man who'd saved them all by opening a door he should have kept closed. The stage made it 30 miles before the wheel broke. Grace heard the crack, felt the lurch, then they were stopped on the side of the road with the driver swearing and kicking at the splintered wood like cursing would fix it. "How long to repair?" Grace asked, leaning out the window with Hope bundled against her chest. The driver was a grizzled man named Patterson who'd seen enough broken wheels to know bad news when he saw it. "Can't repair this? Need a whole new wheel. Nearest station's back in Silver Creek." "We're not going back." "Then you're walking, ma'am, because this stage isn't moving without a new wheel." Grace looked down the road. They were maybe 15 miles from the Colorado border, still in Wyoming territory where Keene's influence reached. Every mile they stayed here was dangerous. "How far to the next town?" she asked. 12 miles south, little mining settlement called Redemption Creek. Might have a wheel, might not. Patterson shrugged. "Or you wait here while I ride back for one. Be 2 days, maybe 3. 2 days sitting on the side of a road with 3 children and a newborn. Grace felt the weight of that decision pressing down on her like the sky was falling. "We'll walk," she said. Patterson stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "Ma'am, you just gave birth. You can't walk 12 miles. "I walked 15 to get to Silver Creek. I can walk 12 more. That was different. That was survival. This is still survival. Grace was already gathering their few belongings from inside the stage. "Just slower." Samuel and Thomas climbed down, both looking worried but not arguing. They'd learned not to argue when their mother had that tone in her voice. Patterson helped unload what little they had. 1 bag of clothes, some food Martha had packed for them, the rifle Grace had carried from Mercer's cabin. She slung it over her shoulder, felt its familiar weight. "You're making a mistake," Patterson said. "Probably. But it's my mistake to make." Grace shifted Hope in her arms, started walking south. "Come on, boys." They walked. The road was better than the mountain trail had been, at least. Packed dirt with wagon ruts to guide them, mostly flat. But Grace's body was still torn up inside, still bleeding more than it should. Every step pulled at stitches the doctor in Silver Creek had sewn, and she could feel things tearing that shouldn't tear. By the second mile, she was limping badly. By the third, Samuel noticed. "Mama, you're bleeding again." Grace looked down. Sure enough, blood was soaking through her skirt, dripping onto the road. Not a lot, but steady. "I'm fine." "You're not fine." "Then I'm functional. That's close enough." Grace kept walking. "How's Thomas?" Samuel glanced at his younger brother, who was trudging along beside them with the glazed expression of someone running on empty. "His fever's back." Grace reached over to touch Thomas's forehead. Hot. Too hot. The boy needed rest and medicine and care, none of which she could give him on a dirt road in the middle of nowhere. "Can you keep walking?" she asked him. Thomas nodded, but his eyes said he was lying. "Just a few more miles," Grace lied back. "We'll rest when we get to town." They walked on. The sun climbed higher, hot for late February. Grace's vision started doing strange things, tunneling and doubling. She'd lost too much blood, she knew. Her body was running on fumes and stubbornness. Around noon, Hope started crying, the angry, desperate cry that meant she was hungry. Grace stopped, sat down right in the middle of the road because she couldn't make it to the side. She got Hope positioned to nurse while Samuel and Thomas stood watch. "Is anyone coming?" Grace asked. Samuel looked both directions. "No, ma'am." The baby latched on, but Grace's milk was thin and weak. Her body didn't have the resources to make much. Hope pulled away frustrated, crying harder. "I'm sorry," Grace whispered. "I'm trying." She switched the baby to the other side, let her nurse what little there was. After a few minutes, Hope gave up and just cried. Grace held her close, rocked her, felt completely helpless. "Maybe we should go back," Thomas said quietly. "No." "But Mama." "I said no." Grace stood up, swaying. "We're not going back. We're going forward. That's all we do now. Forward." She started walking again before either boy could argue. They had maybe 8 miles left. She could make 8 miles. She'd walked further in worse condition, but 3 miles later, she knew she was wrong. Grace's legs just stopped working. One minute she was walking, the next she was on her knees in the road with no memory of falling. Hope was screaming. The boys were trying to help her up, but she couldn't feel her legs anymore. "Mama, please get up," Samuel was saying. "Please." Grace tried. She really did. But her body had finally hit the wall, had finally burned through whatever reserves had been keeping her going. She couldn't get up. "Go," she told Samuel. Her voice came out wrong, slurred. "Take Thomas and Hope. Leave me here. Get to town." "I'm not leaving you." "Samuel, listen to me." "No." Her 9-year-old son crossed his arms, stubborn as his father. "We're not leaving you. We're a family. You said so yourself." Grace wanted to argue, but she didn't have the breath. She sat there in the dirt, holding a screaming baby, bleeding out slowly while her son stood guard. This was how it ended then. Not in a gunfight, not in the cabin, but on a road in the middle of nowhere, her body finally giving up after asking too much of it. She thought about Michael, wondered if she'd see him soon. Thought about Mercer, buried under snow on his mountain. At least she'd gotten the documents sent. At least Keene would pay. That was something. Grace closed her eyes, felt the sun on her face. Not a bad place to die, really. Better than most. Then she heard hoofbeats. Her eyes snapped open. A rider was coming up the road from the south, moving fast. Grace's hand went to the rifle automatically, but she couldn't lift it. Couldn't do anything but sit there and wait. The rider got closer, and Grace saw it was a woman. Older, maybe 50, riding a horse like she'd been born on it. She pulled up short when she saw them, took in the scene with sharp eyes. "Well, hell," the woman said. "You look about 3 steps from dead." "Closer to 2, Grace managed. The woman dismounted, moved to Grace's side. She had a weathered face and hands that looked like they'd done hard work their whole life. "What happened?" "Long story." "I've got time." The woman was already checking Grace over with the efficiency of someone who'd dealt with injuries before. "You gave birth recently?" "Couple weeks ago." "And you're bleeding out because you tore something walking when you should be in bed." It wasn't a question. "Where are you headed?" "Redemption Creek." "That's still 6 miles. You won't make it walking." "I know." The woman looked at Samuel and Thomas, then at the baby still crying in Grace's arms. "This your whole family?" "Yes." "Where's their father?" "Dead. Murdered 2 weeks ago." The woman's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "What's your name?" "Grace Holloway." Well, Grace Holloway, my name's Ruth Brennan, and I run a ranch about 2 miles from here. You and your children are coming with me. I can't pay you. Don't recall asking for payment. Ruth started pulling Grace to her feet. Come on, you can ride double with me. The boys can walk alongside. Grace wanted to refuse, to insist she could manage on her own. But she'd learned something in the last 2 weeks. Sometimes accepting help wasn't weakness. Sometimes it was the only way to survive. Thank you, she said. Ruth got Grace mounted, handed Hope up to her, then swung up behind them. The boys walked on either side as they started down the road. So who murdered your husband? Ruth asked conversationally. Men working for a federal judge named Horace Keene. The land thief? Grace looked back at her, surprised. You know about that? Got the papers yesterday. Some widow sent evidence to Denver, exposed the whole operation. Every newspaper in the territory is running the story. Ruth's voice carried a note of satisfaction. Keene's in prison awaiting trial. Half his associates are running or turning on each other. Biggest corruption scandal in Wyoming history. Grace felt something warm spread through her chest. The papers had done more than just expose Keene. They'd destroyed his entire network. That widow was me, she said quietly. Ruth was silent for a long moment. The papers said the widow's husband was killed. She was hunted through a blizzard, gave birth in a cabin while fighting off assassins. I figured it was newspaper exaggeration. It wasn't. Then you're either the toughest woman I've ever met or the stupidest. Can it be both? Ruth laughed, sharp and genuine. I like you, Grace Holloway. You've got spine. They reached the ranch as the sun was starting to set. It was smaller than Grace expected, just a house and a barn and some corrals, but it looked solid, well-maintained, lived in. Ruth helped Grace down, got her inside to a bedroom that was clean and simple. You'll stay here until you're healed enough to travel. No arguments. I can't impose. You can and you will. I've got space, and your boys can help with chores to earn your keep. Ruth was already moving around the room, pulling out blankets. When's the last time that baby ate properly? This morning, but my milk's not coming in right. Because you're half starved and bleeding out. We'll fix that. Ruth disappeared, came back with bread and cheese and a glass of milk. Eat. All of it. Grace ate because Ruth's tone left no room for argument. The food tasted like heaven, and she felt strength returning almost immediately. Ruth took Hope, checked her over with practiced hands. She's small but strong. Good lungs on her anyway. She handed the baby back. Try nursing again. Bet it works better now. It did. Hope latched on and actually got milk this time, drinking steadily. Grace felt the relief of it, felt her body doing what it was supposed to do for the first time in days. Samuel and Thomas appeared in the doorway, both looking uncertain. Your mama's going to be fine, Ruth told them. But she needs rest. Come on, I'll show you where you'll be sleeping. Can we stay with her? Samuel asked. Tonight you can. But tomorrow you're helping me with chores. I've got horses that need feeding and stalls that need mucking. You know how to work? Yes, ma'am. Good. I don't abide lazy people on my ranch. Ruth's voice was stern, but her eyes were kind. Now get in here and let your mama rest. The boys climbed onto the bed on either side of Grace, careful not to jostle Hope. Grace held her daughter with one arm and wrapped the other around Thomas, who was shivering despite the warm room. His fever, Grace started to say. I see it. I'll make him willow bark tea after you're settled. Ruth pulled a blanket over all of them. Sleep now. Everything else can wait. Grace wanted to stay awake, to keep watch, to make sure they were safe. But exhaustion dragged her down like an anchor. Within minutes, she was asleep with her children tucked around her. She woke sometime in the night to find Ruth sitting in a chair by the bed, rifle across her lap, keeping watch. Their eyes met in the darkness. Go back to sleep, Ruth said quietly. I've got first watch. Grace wanted to ask why this stranger was helping them, what Ruth got out of harboring a wanted woman and her children. But she was too tired to form the words. She just nodded and let sleep take her again. For 3 days, Grace drifted in and out of consciousness. Her body was fighting infection from the tears, and the fever that came with it knocked her flat. Ruth and the boys took care of her, took care of Hope, kept the ranch running. On the 4th day, Grace woke clear-headed for the first time. The fever had broken. Her body was starting to heal, slowly but surely. Ruth brought her soup and sat with her while she ate. You were touch and go there for a while. Wasn't sure you'd pull through. I'm hard to kill. Clearly, Ruth refilled Grace's bowl. Your boys are good workers. Samuel's a natural with horses. Thomas is slower but thorough. They'll do well wherever you end up. About that, Grace said, I need to get to Colorado. My sister's there. You'll need another week at minimum before you're strong enough to travel. I don't have a week. Every day we stay here is dangerous. Dangerous how? Keen's in prison. Keen has friends, people who'll want revenge. Grace set down the bowl. I can't bring that to your door. Ruth was quiet for a moment. 3 years ago, my husband was killed by rustlers. They came to steal our cattle. He fought back. They shot him dead in our yard. The sheriff said there wasn't enough evidence to prosecute. Said it was probably an accident. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry. Be smart. Ruth leaned forward. The sheriff was on the rustlers' payroll. The whole county government was corrupt, bought and paid for. My husband knew it, was gathering evidence against them. That's why they killed him. Grace saw where this was going. You couldn't prove it. No. But I knew. And I've spent 3 years running this ranch alone, knowing the men who murdered my husband walk free. Ruth's eyes were hard. So when I read about you in the papers, about what you did to Keen, I thought maybe there's still some justice in this world. Maybe one woman can make a difference. I didn't do it for justice. I did it for my children. Same thing sometimes. Ruth stood, moved to the window. You can stay here as long as you need. I've got space and I've got guns. Let Keen's friends come if they want. I'm done running from corrupt men. Grace wanted to accept, wanted to stay in this safe place and let someone else stand guard for a while. But she'd learned that safety was temporary, that danger followed her wherever she went. When I'm strong enough to travel, she said, will you help me get to Colorado? I'll do better than that. I'll take you there myself. Ruth turned back to face her. Got a wagon and a team that can make the trip. Was planning to visit my sister in Denver anyway. You have a sister in Denver too? Everyone's got family somewhere. Ruth's smile was thin. Besides, I want to see that Judge Keen gets what's coming to him. Figured I might sit in on his trial, watch justice happen for once. Grace felt something loosen in her chest. She wasn't alone anymore. She had Ruth, had her children, had a path forward. Thank you, she said. Thank me when we get there alive. By the end of the week, Grace could walk without bleeding. By the end of 2 weeks, she could help with chores. Ruth taught her how to shoot properly, how to hold the rifle with confidence instead of fear. You killed men with this, Ruth said, handling the weapon Grace had carried from Mercer's cabin. But you were scared when you did it. Fear makes you hesitate, and hesitation gets you killed. Grace practiced until her shoulder ached, until she could hit a target at 50 yards, until the rifle felt like an extension of her arm instead of a tool she borrowed. Samuel and Thomas thrived on the ranch. Fresh air, good food, work that made them tired in a healthy way instead of exhausted from terror. Thomas's fever finally broke for good, and color came back to his cheeks. Samuel grew taller, filled out, started looking less like a scared child, and more like the young man he'd become. Hope grew fat and content, nursing well now that Grace's body had recovered. She smiled for the first time on a sunny afternoon in March, and Grace cried because her daughter would never know her father, would never know the man who died so she could live. She'll know his story, Ruth said, watching Grace hold the baby. That's something. It's not enough. It never is, but it's what we get. They left for Colorado on the 1st of April. Ruth's wagon was sturdy and loaded with supplies. The boys sat in the back while Grace held Hope up front beside Ruth. The rifle was within easy reach, loaded and ready. The first day passed without incident. They made 20 miles, camped by a creek, kept watch in shifts. The second day was harder. Rain turned the road to mud and slowed them down. They only made 10 miles. On the third day, they saw riders behind them. Ruth spotted them first, 3 men about a mile back, keeping pace but not closing. Could be nothing. Could be something, Grace said. Her hand went to the rifle. We're maybe 30 miles from Denver. If they're going to make a move, it'll be before we reach the city. Ruth snapped the reins, urged the horses faster. Get the boys down low. Cover them with blankets. Grace climbed into the wagon bed, got Samuel and Thomas positioned on the floor, piled supplies over them. Stay quiet. Don't move no matter what you hear. Mama, Samuel started. No arguments. Stay hidden. She climbed back up front with Hope tucked inside her coat. The riders were closer now, definitely following. Grace could see they were armed. "How good are you with that rifle?" Ruth asked. "Good enough." "Then get ready to use it." The riders came on fast, cutting the distance. Within minutes, they were close enough that Grace could see their faces. Hard men, professional, the kind Keene would hire. One of them called out, "Grace Holloway, we just want to talk." "They always want to talk," Ruth muttered. "Right before they start shooting." Grace raised the rifle, sighted down the barrel. The closest rider was maybe 100 yards out. Moving target, tough shot. But she'd practiced. "Turn around and ride away," she called back. "This is your only warning." The riders didn't slow down. If anything, they came faster. Grace fired. The shot went high, missed the lead rider but scared his horse. The animal spooked, threw its rider, went running. The other two riders pulled up short, suddenly cautious. "Next one's not a warning," Grace shouted. She was already reloading, hand steady. One of the riders raised his rifle. Ruth saw it, yanked the reins hard left. The wagon lurched off the road into rougher ground. A shot cracked past where they'd been. Grace braced against the wagon side, aimed, fired again. This time she hit something. She saw one of the riders grab his shoulder, saw blood. He wheeled his horse around, started riding back the way they'd come. The last rider hesitated, looking at his wounded companion, at the woman in the wagon who could clearly shoot. He made a choice. He ran. Ruth got the wagon back on the road, urged the horses into a gallop. They couldn't maintain that pace for long, but they needed distance. Behind them, the riders were giving up, turning back. "They'll try again," Ruth said. "Maybe not today, but soon. Then we keep moving." Grace checked Hope, made sure the baby was all right. She was crying from the noise and chaos, but unharmed. "How far to Denver?" "If we push hard, we can make it by nightfall." They pushed hard. The horses were lathered and exhausted by the time Denver came into view, but they'd made it. The city spread out before them, buildings and streets and people. Civilization, safety, or close to it. Ruth knew where she was going. She navigated streets until they reached a modest house on the edge of town. A woman came out onto the porch. Ruth's sister, Grace guessed from the family resemblance. "You made it," the sister said. Then she saw Grace and the children. "This is the widow?" "This is Grace Holloway and her family," Ruth confirmed. "They need a safe place to stay." The sister looked at Grace for a long moment, taking in the rifle, the baby, the exhausted children climbing out of the wagon. "The paper said you killed 4 men." "5," Grace corrected quietly. "I killed 5 men." "Good. They had it coming." The sister stepped aside. "Come in. You're safe here." Grace followed Ruth into the house, her children trailing behind her. Safe. The word felt foreign, impossible. She'd been running for so long that stopping felt wrong. But Hope was asleep in her arms, and Samuel and Thomas were already asking about food, and Ruth was introducing them to her sister like they were family instead of strangers. Maybe safe wasn't impossible after all. That night, Grace sat in a borrowed bedroom with her children asleep around her. Tomorrow she'd contact William Byers, the newspaper editor. She'd give her testimony, make sure Keene's trial had everything it needed. She'd find work, find a permanent place to stay, start building something stable. But tonight she just held Hope and watched her breathe, counted the miracle of each breath, each heartbeat. This tiny girl who'd been born in violence and blood, who carried Cole Mercer's name, who represented everything Grace had fought for. "Your daddy would have loved you," Grace whispered. "He would have been so proud." Hope didn't answer, just kept sleeping, innocent and perfect and completely unaware of what it had cost to keep her alive. Grace looked out the window at Denver's lights, thought about the cabin on Black Ridge where Mercer had died alone, thought about the documents that had traveled from that cabin to this city, bringing down an empire. She'd walked through hell to get here. 5 miles through a blizzard, 15 miles to Silver Creek, 12 miles to Ruth's ranch, 30 more to Denver. All told, she'd walked over 60 miles with a newborn and 2 young boys, bleeding and broken and refusing to stop. And she'd made it. Grace closed her eyes, let exhaustion take her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, she could sleep without keeping one eye open. She was safe. For now, that was enough. Safe lasted 3 days. On the 4th morning in Denver, Grace woke to find Samuel standing by the window, staring out at the street with the same expression he'd worn in Silver Creek when the killers were circling. "What is it?" she asked, sitting up carefully. Her body still ached, still reminded her daily of what it had been through. "Man across the street. He's been there since dawn, just watching." Grace moved to the window, looked where Samuel was pointing. Sure enough, a man stood in a doorway opposite Ruth's sister's house. Well-dressed, clean-shaven. He looked like he belonged there, except for the way his eyes never left their front door. "Could be nothing," Grace said, but she didn't believe it. "Could be something," Samuel echoed Ruth's words from the road. Grace found Ruth in the kitchen, told her about the watcher. Ruth looked out the window, her face going hard. "That's not random," Ruth said. "Someone knows you're here. Keen's still in prison. I checked yesterday. Keen's not the only one who wants those documents buried. He had partners, associates, people who stand to lose everything if his trial goes forward." Ruth moved away from the window. "You need to testify today. Get it done before they make their move." Grace had been putting off meeting with William Byers, the newspaper editor. She told herself it was because she needed to rest, needed to get her strength back. But the truth was simpler and uglier. She was afraid. Afraid that testifying would make her a target again, would put her children in danger again, would mean she could never stop running. But looking at that man watching their house, she realized she was already a target, had been since the moment Michael discovered those documents. The only question was whether she'd fight or hide. She'd never been good at hiding. "Get the children ready," Grace said. "We're going to the newspaper." William Byers' office was in a 3-story building downtown, bustling with activity. Reporters shouted to each other, typewriters clacked. The smell of ink and paper hung thick in the air. Grace stood in the doorway holding hope, while Samuel and Thomas pressed close to her sides, overwhelmed by the noise and chaos. A young man approached them. "Can I help you?" "I need to see William Byers. Tell him Grace Holloway is here." The young man's eyes went wide. He disappeared up a flight of stairs, returned 30 seconds later with an older man who had ink stains on his fingers and fierce intelligence in his eyes. "Mrs. Holloway," Byers said, extending his hand, "I've been hoping you'd come." His office was quieter, lined with books and old newspapers. He cleared chairs for Grace and the boys, then sat behind his desk and pulled out a notebook. "I need your full testimony," he said without preamble. "Everything that happened. Start from the beginning." Grace told him. All of it. Michael's murder, the flight through the blizzard, the cabin at Black Ridge, Cole Mercer's sacrifice, the birth during the gunfight, the walk to Silver Creek, and then to Denver. She didn't leave anything out, didn't soften any of the violence. Byers wrote it all down, his hand moving steadily across the page. When she finished, he sat back and looked at her with something like awe. "That's the most remarkable story I've ever heard," he said quietly. "It's not a story. It's what happened." "I know, that's what makes it remarkable." Byers flipped through his notes. "With your testimony and the documents you provided, we can bury Keen and his entire network. Federal prosecutors are already building their case. Your husband's evidence is the foundation of it." "Michael would be glad to know that." "He should be here to see it." Byers' voice carried genuine regret. "I'm sorry for your loss." Grace had heard those words 100 times in the last month. They never meant anything. But from Byers, who'd risked his own life publishing corruption stories, they almost did. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you testify at Keen's trial. It starts in 2 weeks. The prosecution needs you to walk the jury through how your husband discovered the fraud, what happened when he tried to expose it, everything." Byers leaned forward. "I won't lie to you, Mrs. Holloway. Testifying will make you a target. Keen's associates will do everything they can to discredit you, intimidate you, maybe worse. They've already tried worse. I'm still here. You're one woman with 3 children and no money. How long can you keep fighting?" Grace looked down at Hope, asleep in her arms, then at Samuel and Thomas, both listening to every word. "As long as I have to." Byers studied her for a long moment. "I believe you, but you're going to need help, protection, at minimum. The federal marshals can—" "No marshals. Half of them are probably on Keen's payroll." "Then what?" Grace didn't have an answer. She'd been so focused on surviving, on getting to Denver, on delivering her testimony, that she hadn't thought beyond it. What came after? Where would they live? How would she feed her children? I'll figure something out, she said, standing. Thank you for your time, Mr. Byers. Wait. Byers pulled open a desk drawer, retrieved an envelope. This came for you yesterday, from Wyoming. Grace took the envelope with shaking hands. It was addressed to her in unfamiliar handwriting. She opened it carefully. Inside was a single piece of paper and a deed. The letter was from Martha Preston, the boarding house owner from Silver Creek. Grace went up to Black Ridge like you asked. Found Cole Mercer's cabin, or what's left of it. Buried him proper on the mountain he loved. Carved his name on a tree since stone was too hard to come by. Found something else, too. Mercer left a will with a lawyer in town years back, forgotten about it. Turns out he owned that cabin and 160 acres around it, free and clear. Will says in case of his death, the property goes to whoever has the courage to survive what I couldn't. Lawyer says that's you. Deed's enclosed. It's yours if you want it. Martha. Grace stared at the deed. 160 acres in Wyoming, including a half-destroyed cabin and the grave of a man who'd saved her life. It wasn't much, but it was land, a place to start over. What is it? Samuel asked. Grace showed him the deed. Mr. Mercer left us his cabin. The one that got blown up? Yes. Why would he do that? Grace read Martha's letter again, saw the words Mercer had chosen for his will. Whoever has the courage to survive what I couldn't. He'd known, somehow, known that he was hiding on that mountain instead of living, that survival and life weren't the same thing. Because he wanted someone to do better than he did, Grace said. She looked at Byers, at the deed in her hands, at her children. An idea was forming, crazy and impossible, and maybe the only way forward. I need to borrow money, she said. Byers raised an eyebrow. For what? To rebuild a cabin, to buy supplies, tools, seed, to start a ranch. Grace felt something stirring in her chest that might have been hope. I can't keep running, can't keep dragging my children from town to town, always looking over our shoulder. But if I had land, a home, something permanent, you'd be a sitting target, or I'd be someone with a reason to fight back. Grace met his eyes. I've got 160 acres in Wyoming. That's more than most people ever get. I can make something of it. You're a widow with a newborn and 2 young boys. You can't run a ranch alone. I won't be alone. I'll find people who need work, people I can trust. I'll build something. Grace heard the certainty in her own voice, surprising herself. And when Keene's trial comes, I'll testify. Then I'll go home to my land and dare anyone to try taking it from me. Byers was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled, pulled out a checkbook. How much do you need? The loan Byers gave her was generous, enough to buy a wagon, supplies, and hire help for the first season. Grace used some of it to buy passage back to Wyoming, hired Ruth as her first ranch hand. Ruth's sister decided to come too, tired of city life and intrigued by the idea of building something from nothing. They left Denver 2 days later, heading north. The trial wouldn't start for another 10 days, which gave Grace time to assess the property, start planning repairs. She'd come back for the trial, give her testimony, then return to Black Ridge permanently. The wagon was loaded heavy with lumber, tools, seed, food. Samuel and Thomas rode in back, excited despite everything. Building a ranch sounded like an adventure to them, not the desperate gamble it actually was. Hope slept against Grace's chest, content and growing. She'd be walking by next spring, talking by the summer after that. Grace tried to imagine her daughter growing up on that mountain, running through trees, learning to ride horses. It seemed impossible, but then again, everything seemed impossible until you did it. They reached Black Ridge on a gray afternoon in late April. The cabin looked worse than Grace remembered. Half the roof gone, walls scarred by bullets and fire. Mercer's grave was visible nearby, marked by a carved tree just like Martha had said. Grace stood looking at it for a long time. Ruth came to stand beside her. He saved your life, Ruth said. He did more than that. He gave me a chance to save myself. Grace touched the tree, felt the rough bark under her fingers. I won't waste it. They got to work. Ruth and her sister Ellen started clearing debris while Grace assessed what could be salvaged. The foundation was solid. Some of the walls were salvageable. They'd need a new roof, new windows, new door. But the bones of the cabin were good. Samuel and Thomas helped where they could, carrying wood, clearing brush. They worked until dark, then made camp in the clearing. Grace nursed Hope by the fire while the others ate. It's going to take months, Ellen said, looking at the cabin. Maybe longer. Then it takes longer. Grace shifted hope to her other breast. We've got time. Do we? What about the trial? I'll go, testify, come back. 2 days in Denver at most. And if Keen's people come here while you're gone, Ruth asked, then you shoot them. Grace said it matter-of-factly. I've got faith you can handle yourself. Ruth smiled grimly. Damn right I can. They worked for a week straight, and the cabin started to take shape. A new roof went up, rough but solid. Windows were patched with oiled cloth until they could afford glass. The door was rehung, reinforced with iron Ruth had brought from her ranch. Grace learned carpentry by doing it badly, then better, then almost well. Her hands developed calluses, her back got stronger. She was still healing from Hope's birth, still bleeding occasionally, but working helped. It gave her body something to do besides hurt. Samuel proved to be a natural builder, understanding angles and measurements instinctively. Thomas was better with animals. He made friends with a wild horse that wandered into camp, spent hours trying to gentle it. On the 8th day, a rider came up the mountain. Grace saw him from a distance, grabbed the rifle, but the rider was waving a white cloth, calling out that he was friendly. He turned out to be a young man named James, maybe 20, looking for work. Heard in town there's a widow building a ranch up here. Figured you might need hands. Grace looked him over. He was thin, wore clothes that had seen better days, carried himself like someone who'd known hard times. You know ranching? Grew up on one in Montana. Family lost it to debt 3 years back. James met her eyes directly. I work hard, don't drink much, and I'm good with horses. Pay me fair and I'll stay as long as you need me. I can pay you in room and board for now, wages once we're productive. That's fair. Grace hired him on the spot. Having another set of hands made everything move faster. Within 2 days, James had built a proper corral and started training Thomas's wild horse. Within a week, he'd framed out a bunkhouse where he and any other hands could sleep. More people came. A woman named Sarah, who'd been widowed herself, looking for a fresh start. An older man called Dutch, who'd been a ranch foreman before age, and whiskey cost him his job, now sober and desperate to prove he still had value. A Mexican family, the Rodriguezes, who'd been run off their land by the same corruption that killed Michael. Grace hired them all, gave them shelter, food, a share of whatever the ranch produced. She was building something bigger than just a home. She was building a community of people who'd been broken by corruption and violence, giving them a place to put themselves back together. The cabin expanded. More rooms, more space. A proper kitchen, beds for everyone. It stopped being Mercer's cabin and became Grace's house, loud with voices and full of life. 2 days before Keen's trial, Grace left for Denver. Ruth stayed behind to run things, James as her second. Grace took Samuel with her. She wanted him to see justice happen, to understand that his father's death meant something. They arrived the night before the trial, stayed with Byers. The prosecutor came by that evening to go over Grace's testimony. Just tell the truth, he said. Walk them through the documents, explain how your husband discovered the fraud. The rest will follow. The courthouse was packed the next morning. Grace had never seen so many people crammed into one space. She recognized reporters from a dozen newspapers, territorial officials, federal marshals. And in the front row, in chains, Judge Horace Keen. He looked smaller than she'd imagined. Older, gray, defeated. This was the man who'd ordered her husband killed, who'd stolen fortunes, who'd corrupted an entire territory. He looked like someone's grandfather. Grace took the stand and told her story. The prosecutor guided her through it, asking questions that let her explain everything. She showed the jury the documents, walked them through Michael's findings, described his murder in detail that made several jurors look away. When she got to the part about the cabin, about giving birth while killers attacked, the courtroom went completely silent. Even Keen was staring at her, something like shock on his face. "And you walked 15 miles after giving birth?" the prosecutor asked. "Yes." "While being hunted?" "Yes." "Why didn't you just give up, hand over the documents, save yourself and your children?" Grace looked at Keen when she answered, "Because my husband died for those documents. Because justice doesn't happen unless someone's willing to fight for it. Because I wanted my children to grow up knowing their father wasn't murdered for nothing." The defense attorney tried to shake her testimony, tried to paint her as unreliable, as a woman driven mad by grief. But Grace didn't break. She answered every question calmly, backed up every claim with evidence. When she stepped down from the stand, she knew they'd won. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. They came back with guilty verdicts on all counts: federal conspiracy, fraud, corruption, accessory to murder. Keene would spend the rest of his life in prison. Grace watched him being led away in chains. He looked at her once, their eyes meeting. She saw no remorse there, no understanding, just anger that he'd been caught. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed her. They wanted interviews, wanted to write her story. Grace pushed through them, got to the wagon where Samuel was waiting. "Is it over?" he asked. "It's over." They started back to Black Ridge that afternoon. Grace didn't want to spend another night in Denver, didn't want to be celebrated or made into a symbol. She just wanted to go home. The ranch was thriving when they returned. Ruth had organized the workers, got the first crops planted. The house was finished, furniture built, everything functional if not fancy. It looked like a real home. That night, Grace gathered everyone around the fire: Ruth, Ellen, James, Sarah, Dutch, the Rodriguez family, her children. 14 people total, living and working together on land that had been empty a month ago. "I want to say something," Grace started. Her voice carried over the crackling fire. "Most of you came here because you had nowhere else to go. Because corruption or violence or bad luck took everything from you. I know what that's like. I lost my husband, nearly lost my children, nearly lost myself." She looked around the circle, saw her story reflected in their faces. "This ranch is more than just a place to work. It's proof that we survived, that we didn't let the bastards win." Grace felt emotion rising in her throat. Cole Mercer lived on this mountain for 15 years, trying to hide from the world. He let corruption and betrayal make him small. When I asked him why he let me in, he said it was because my son was dying. But I think it was more than that. I think he was tired of surviving alone. She picked up Hope, held her daughter where everyone could see. "This is Hope Mercer Holloway. She was born in that cabin during a gunfight. She's alive because a stranger decided that opening his door mattered more than staying safe." Grace's voice broke slightly. "Mercer died believing he was a coward who ran from the fight. But he was wrong. He died protecting what mattered. And now we're going to live here, on his land, doing what he couldn't. We're going to build something good. We're going to take care of each other. We're going to prove that surviving alone isn't the same as living together." Ruth raised her cup. "To Mercer." "To Mercer," the others echoed. Grace drank, felt the burn of whiskey, felt the warmth of the fire and the people around her. This was family now. Not blood, but choice. People who'd been broken and decided to rebuild together. The years that followed weren't easy. The ranch struggled through bad winters and dry summers. Keene's associates tried twice more to kill Grace, once with hired guns who made it within a mile before James and Dutch drove them off, once with poison that Ruth caught before anyone ate it. But they survived. The ranch grew. They added cattle, then horses. Built a proper barn, then a second bunkhouse. More people came looking for work and stayed for the community. Samuel grew into a young man who could build anything and shoot straight. Thomas became the ranch's horseman, gentle and patient with even the wildest animals. Hope learned to walk, then run, then ride before she was 4 years old. Grace taught them all about their father, about what he'd done and why it mattered. She taught them about Mercer too, about the man who'd saved them because it was right even though it cost him everything. 5 years after the trial, Grace received a letter from William Byers. Judge Keene had died in prison. The corruption network he'd built was completely dismantled. More than 200 families had their stolen land returned. Laws had been changed to prevent the same fraud from happening again. Grace read the letter to her children that night. "Your father changed the world. Remember that. One honest man saw something wrong and refused to look away. That's all it takes sometimes. One person willing to fight. And one woman willing to finish what he started," Samuel added. Grace smiled. "Yes, that too." 10 years after the blizzard, the ranch at Black Ridge was known throughout Wyoming. People came from other territories to see the place built by a widow and her community of survivors. They came to hear Grace's story, to meet the woman who'd walked through hell and came out the other side. Grace usually disappointed them. She didn't look like a legend. She looked like a rancher, weathered, worn, with scars she didn't bother hiding. She'd remarried eventually, to James, who'd stayed year after year until staying became permanent. They had 2 more children together, boys who grew up calling Samuel and Thomas their brothers, who called Hope their sister without qualification. But she never forgot Michael. never forgot Mercer. She kept Michael's wedding ring on a chain around her neck, kept Mercer's rifle over the fireplace. Every year on the anniversary of that blizzard, she walked to Mercer's grave and told him how the ranch was doing. "We've got 40 head of cattle now," she said on the 15th anniversary. Hope was beside her, 17 years old and already taller than her mother. "And we're buying the property to the south, expanding. Samuel's getting married next spring. Thomas is talking about starting his own ranch near Colorado. The house is loud and messy and full of people who needed a second chance." Grace touched the carved tree. "You gave me that chance. Gave all of us that chance. I hope wherever you are, you know it mattered. You mattered." Hope put her hand over her mother's. "Tell me again about the night I was born." Grace had told the story 100 times, but she told it again. About the storm and the cabin, about the men with guns and the choices that had to be made. About a man who'd spent 15 years alone deciding at the last moment that connection mattered more than safety. "He never knew you," Grace said, looking at her daughter. "But he died so you could live. That's what love is sometimes. Sacrifice from strangers who become family." Hope was quiet for a moment. "I want to name my first daughter Mercer, if that's all right." Grace felt tears sting her eyes. That would be perfect. They walked back to the house together, mother and daughter, surrounded by the land Mercer had left them. The ranch spread out below, busy with activity. James was working with the new horses. Ruth and Ellen were arguing about something near the barn. Samuel was building an addition onto the bunkhouse. Thomas was teaching a group of children how to ride. It was loud and chaotic and imperfect. People fought and made up, failed and tried again. Nothing was smooth or easy, but it was alive. It was family. It was proof that surviving trauma didn't mean trauma won. It just meant you got the chance to build something better after. Grace stood on the porch of the house she'd rebuilt, holding her daughter's hand, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. Behind her, she heard laughter and the clatter of dinner being prepared. In her pocket, she carried the deed to 160 acres that had become so much more. She'd walked 60 miles through hell to get here. She'd buried a husband and a stranger who became a hero. She'd given birth during a gunfight and killed men who tried to murder her children. She'd testified against corruption and won. And now, 15 years later, she stood on land she owned, surrounded by families she'd chosen, looking at a future she'd bled to create. It wasn't the life she'd planned. It was harder, uglier, scarred by violence and loss. But it was hers, built on sacrifice and stubbornness and the belief that surviving alone was never the point. The point was surviving together, building something that outlasted the trauma, choosing connection over safety, community over isolation, hope over fear. That was Mercer's final gift, Grace realized. Not the land, but the lesson. That opening your door to people who needed help wasn't weakness. It was the only thing that made survival worth it. She squeezed Hope's hand, turned to go inside where her family waited. Behind her, the mountain stood silent and permanent, holding the grave of a man who'd learned that lesson too late, but passed it on anyway. And on Black Ridge, where a cabin had once stood empty and cold, a ranch full of life and laughter proved that even the loneliest places could become home if someone was brave enough to build it. Grace Holloway had walked through fire, blood, and gunpowder to get here. She'd do it all again if she had to. But tonight, she was just going to have dinner with her family and count her blessings, hard-won as they were. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.